Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. I sense a great disturbance in the force. That's right, it's the revenge of the Sythis. Don't let her green and white color identity fool you. Sythis is definitely working for the dark side. A 2-mana enchantress that's also an enchantment, and one that gains us life in addition to the traditional enchantress card draw ability. She even looks like she's about to start shooting lightning out of her hands. Sythis is the second most popular commander to emerge from Modern Horizons 2, and her page automatically filled up with all of the classic Enchantress goodies. She lost a color compared to stuff like Tuvasa, but in exchange, she draws more cards, which lets her dig even faster to find some busted enchantments. Let's check out her deck by grabbing it from the average deck feature and importing it to the Architect deck building website. As is tradition in this series, any swaps we make to improve the list must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral, or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Through power, she gains victory. I think a lot of this list is what we would expect to see, with enchantresses all over the place, and some really cool... Hold up. What? What is that price tag? Nuh-uh. Okay, so it looks like the average list contains some reserve list cards, Replenish and Serra Sanctum, pushing the cost of the deck into the absurds of dollars. We've seen expensive price points for an average deck in this series in the past, but all the same, this price for an average deck makes me wince. So, unlike the question of how Maz Kanata acquired Luke's lightsaber, we will address this. As always, we have an honorable mentions section in these videos to discuss playing these commanders on a higher and a lower budget. Suffice it to say though, I am not going to labor under the assumption that everyone has access to these cards. I don't care what the average deck list says, these be pricey. So, more to come on this. Real quick though, I'm gonna finish that survey of this deck just to make sure we've properly gotten our bearings. But yeah, screw that price tag, dang. Okay, so let's keep looking through what's in this deck. This list may look pretty familiar to anyone who's built Karametra God of Harvests as an Enchantress deck. In fact, Karametra even appears in this average deck list. However, with Tuvasa and now Sythis in the mix, I think Karametra is finally free to explore new pastures, literally. Though she was once the default Selesnya Enchantress commander, her kit really allows her to focus more on a Selesnya landfall strategy, while Sythis can properly take the Selesnya Enchantress mantle. The most important comparison for us to make for Sythis is, of course, Tuvasa. I'm confident that many folks will prefer to stay with Tuvasa and use Sythis in the 99 of that deck, because Tuvasa provides another color and a source of commander damage right there in the command zone. However, discussing which commander is better would be pretty reductive. These abilities are different, and many a player has been hungry for an Enchantress commander that draws for each enchantment we play, not just for the first enchantment we play. So the interesting question is, how does this deck differ? We've got our important components. Tons of enchantresses help fill our hand. Our typical utilities, such as ramp and removal, will also come in the form of enchantments to help feed the engine. We also have lots of protective Pillow Fort cards to keep us safe, which is a huge boon while we dig. The trickiest part of this deck, though, is the win conditions. We have a few obvious ones, like Sigil of the Empty Throne, Archon of Sun's Grace, and the like, but we do have to be very cognizant of our ability to actually close out that game. Life gain can be a potential ingredient in this formula, too, as we can see from the Aetherflux Reservoir Death Star in the average list. Pew pew. Okay, so we're almost ready to get into it, but real quick, let's get back to these two. Yeah, I'm just not going to assume that everyone building this commander actually has these cards. Chop them out and cut the cost of the deck by over $450. Goodbye. They are in timeout. Serra Sanctum will get swapped for just a land. And what will replace the Replenish? Well, let's get into it. I'm going to do 3 sections for this video as usual, but there will be a small twist. Oh yeah, we're going extra. Everything that transpires will do so according to our design. First, I want to talk about our mana. Pretty standard stuff, but it could use a little extra flourish. Next, we'll discuss victory. How does Sythis take control of the Intergalactic Senate? Finally, I want to devote the whole 3rd section to budget. Even kicking out those 2 pricey reserve list cards, there are still lots of budget swaps that we can make. So we will have 2 deck lists for this video, one from the average and one for a slightly tighter budget. So let's get into it, starting with our mana. If we want power, unlimited power, we'd better make sure that we check on our mana resources. Our deck will be fully operational by the time our opponents arrive. The first thing to discuss about the mana is, of course, the lands themselves. We're running a pretty low land count here. 33 lands is a dangerous number. Like, this is not suitable for most decks at all. However, in this case, I think this specific commander can actually totally get away with it. She's 2 mana and she's a draw engine that starts a value train rolling right away. It's not uncommon for Enchantress players to stay slim on lands because the Enchantresses really do draw them that many cards. So consider this commander an exception, but I think we'll be okay with the land count here. What we're not as okay with are the non-enchantment cards in the deck, though. I did a quick count, and this average deck contains 33 lands, 26 non-enchantments, and 41 enchantments. I don't like it. That's too many non-enchantment cards, so I'm going to get real harsh on those non-enchantments because they are a huge stopper in our value train. When every enchantment can draw us 1, 2, or even 4 cards, non-enchantment cards are a liability that stop that waterfall from flowing, so we're going to be real critical on them, and it starts with the mana accelerants. Arcane Signet? Shoo away. Soul Ring is allowed to stay, I guess, and Aetherflux is a win condition, but Signet, you are a mana source that will be swapped out for a Wolf Willow Haven. We want enchantments doing this job. Then there are the mana dorks. So, look, the idea on these is really nice. Our commander is a 2-drop, so these coming down on turn 1 sounds very efficient to work around that obvious turn 2 play. However, these are a crummy late game draw. I just do not like 1-mana 1/1s that don't draw us cards. I am chopping and swapping. These 3 enchantments cost more mana, but that's fine because they also will replace themselves when our Enchantresses trigger. Our commander comes down on turn 2, these are a great play on turn 3, and they'll draw us a card, or even better in the late game, they could draw us like 4 cards. That's potential that I just don't want to pass up. Karametra herself also falls in the discussion of mana. She's cool, but ultimately, unless building towards flavor, I don't think Sythis needs her god in her deck. Finding lands is not going to be a struggle. The last thing I'm going to do in this section is look critically at Starfield Mystic and Herald of the Pantheon. I'm more interested in these cost reducers for Sythis than I would be for other Enchantress decks, but ultimately, I still don't think they need to be here. Their goal is solid. They help us chain through multiple enchantments in one turn, which is cool. Thing is, there are fewer than 30 cards in this deck that these will reduce the cost of, because a lot of our enchantments don't have generic mana costs, just single white or green pips. And I'm always iffy about cards that only help with mana on a third of our deck, or perhaps more appropriately stated, help reduce the cost of less than half of the non-land cards in our deck. If they were Enchantresses themselves, I'd totally be sweeter on them, but even cutting these, there are still 12 plus sources of mana acceleration in this deck, assisted greatly by the fact that our commander draws so many cards that we're nearly always guaranteed to hit land drops. That's even why cards like Exploration have become such a popular pick for Enchantress decks too. A lot of lands wind up in our hand. So I think we're okay without these cost reducers. The ultimate push for me is that this deck contains the card Flickering Ward, which can bounce itself back to hand, recasting itself multiple times. This card's incredible, MVP of the deck, proccing Enchantress triggers at will. I want to make sure that we've got cards that support engines like this, and I don't think the non-enchantment creatures here do the trick. You might even say that they're looking for love in Alderaan places. Speaking of Flickering Ward, there are some other awesome things this commander is up to too, so let's explore that in part 2, where we cheat death and analyze our best path to victory. It's not enough for our deck to just not lose. We also have to make sure that we can, win. Let's start with the not losing part. A substantial amount of our interaction is packed into enchantment form. We have lots of enchantments that deal with other players' pesky artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. There are also some instant speed spells to help us react to things that our sorcery speed enchantments can't always target too. Then we have the board wipes. Austere Command is really interesting because it allows us to be really one-sided against artifacts. That one-sidedness of board wipes is of particular interest to me. So when it comes to this here Wrath of God, I honestly think we'd prefer to try out Winds of Wrath. We aren't swimming in auras necessarily, but we do have more than the average deck out there, which opens up a potential for this card to leave an Enchantress alive while still dealing with problem creatures across the field. As a bonus, if we have an enchantment like Kenrith's Transformation locking down a commander's abilities, the last thing we want is for that commander to go back to the command zone so that it can be resummoned and start wreaking havoc all over again. Winds of Wrath helps us keep that kind of thing on lock a lot more easily, and it's also a much cheaper Wrath to acquire. Next, I want to talk about Stony Silence. This is a really intense way to lock down enemy artifacts, including and especially mana rocks. I totally get why it's here, and I fully support players who wish to keep it, especially if they routinely encounter out-of-control artifact decks. Chalk this up to personal taste, I suppose, but I'm just not as enamored by it. With cards like Aura Shards and Seals and such already in the average list, it's my opinion that our artifact hate is already pretty darn good. And in particular, there's an enchantment that I want to get into this deck pronto. Meet the best white card you're not playing. Righteous Aura. Pillow Fort to the max. For 1 white mana and 2 life, we can negate an attack, or even a big damage dealing spell. This card is bonkers. It doesn't even target the source of the damage, which means it gets around Voltron commanders with Shroud or Hexproof. This is one of the best Pillow Fort cards in the game, and our commander even refunds the tiny life payments that it would cost to use this thing. Play this card, you won't be sorry. Now let's discuss the actual methods of victory. We have a few things we can rely upon, but they are few. Sigil of the Empty Throne pumps out a decent number of angels. Archon and Ajani's Chosen will eventually override a board too, albeit more slowly. Starfield of Nyx can animate our enchantments, though this line is risky because it makes them vulnerable to creature removal, including wrath effects, so this has to be very carefully timed. The most interesting ones are, I think, the mana sinks. Over time, we can make a lot of mana, especially with stuff like Sanctum Weaver. Thus, Destiny Spinner can actually make some pretty dang big beaters in the late game, and Luminarch Ascension is a terrific place to put a bunch of mana to close out a game with more angels than our enemies can possibly hope to deal with. Still, these win conditions are few in number. Our commander is a very potent draw engine, so I have no doubt we'll draw down to find one of these eventually, but the point is that it still takes time, and we want to shorten the window between the moment we establish impervious control on the board and the moment when we can officially take everyone else out of the game. Not just because we don't want the game to drag on forever, but also because every turn that passes is another turn where someone could draw a Bane of Progress and scupper us completely. Thus, I want to get some other win con cards in here. However, I have to make room first. I'll just make 2 final cuts. The first is Arasta. Although I like this card and its token output, pieces of it are matchup dependent and puts our opponents in control of our benefit, which isn't really my favorite. Then I'm also going to do the unthinkable. I think we're okay without the Eternal Witness. Listen, I know this card's great, but on the EDH Rec podcast, we've been saying for a long time now, way back in episode 27 to be precise, that you really should take advantage of this effect being on a body if you're going to use it to its full potential, whether you're blinking it or reanimating it and such like that. This deck isn't doing those things. In fact, since this card isn't an enchantment, it does in fact miss a few points. It can reclaim an enchantment, but this isn't a deck that needs to look backward when it has so many other amazing enchantments that it can draw, and it will draw them by playing more enchantments. Just like with the Mana Dorks, I don't think our utility effects should come in the form of non-enchantment cards. I think we can save those valuable spots for the win condition cards, because our deck is already flush with ways to get good cards into our hand, and we need good win conditions a lot more. Thus, to business. This isn't a Voltron deck, but Ancestral Mask is a silly card. This doesn't even just count our enchantments, it counts all of them on the field. I've almost never seen this card hit the field without immediately granting the enchanted creature a minimum of 16 power. Throw this on a flying creature, and that's going to be a big issue for someone across the field. One of the other ways our deck wins is with tokens, but the tokens themselves tend to be slightly smaller. I think it would behoove us to improve those tokens to make them punchier so they can take an opponent down in just 1 or 2 combat steps rather than several. I've therefore got 2 cards I'm interested in here. The first is Shalai. Just like the Destiny Spinner and Luminarch Ascension we saw earlier, this is a great mana sink, but the real selling point for me is that it does double duty by protecting our stuff while also delivering a useful endgame. And speaking of tokens, the next one is Jol Royale. She makes us tokens along the way, but she also turns the bazillions of cards we draw into lethal damage. Seriously, this effect could turn all our 2/2 tokens into 12/12s without breaking a sweat. That's honestly my low estimate. This is a great finisher. Oh, and to help along with this crazy huge engine, let's also discuss that Flickering Ward in the deck. This card's absolutely an incredible engine to get tons of repeated cheap Enchantress triggers, especially to get lots of angels with Sigil of the Empty Throne, or even lots of storm counts on the Aetherflux Reservoir. This card is also technically a mana sink to power up our late game win conditions. Therefore, how about we also add in a Whip Silk? It's the green version, and it does basically the same job. Superb redundancy here. As we can see, the Sythis follow the rule of 2. And you know what? To help make sure we can find those powerful engines, I don't think it's all that crazy to add in a creature that will specifically help us locate them. Heliod's Pilgrim searches these auras right out of the deck for us. Or if need be, it can find a removal enchantment, or even a cheap ramp enchantment. But finding the most powerful, bouncy auras in the deck is itself more than enough reason to get this card in here. Even if this card isn't an enchantment itself, it unlocks a bazillion Enchantress triggers by finding our most powerful engine. Finally, I gotta be honest, a Pillow Fort deck that draws bunches of cards and wants a clean way to end the game, I don't know that I've seen a better place for Approach of the Second Sun. If we cast this thing twice, we win. It goes back into the deck 7 cards down, but that's really easy for us to fetch back out. Our Enchantresses can get there with just 2 or 3 more casts. Straight up, you win the game effects aren't everyone's cup of tea, which is totally fair. But I do personally appreciate the ticking clock minigame that this card imbues into the play experience once it gets cast. And frankly, I much prefer this kind of win condition over, for instance, tutoring out an infinite combo, or worse, a much more gruelingly long game where it's clear the Enchantress Pillow Fort is too fortified to be disrupted, but it's slowly trying to peck people to death with just some 2/2 cat tokens. As win conditions go, especially when this card is less than $1, this is a pretty cool one. Plus, it is perfectly on theme for our Dark Side commander to wait for the alignment of celestial bodies to line up the final blow. You may fire when ready. Those are the last of our swaps for this first version of the deck, but real quick, before we discuss budget options in part 3, let's cover some honorable mentions for Sythis players who might splurge on this deck and look for cards to use without being tied to a budget restriction. First, this deck contains a Heliod to capitalize on the life gain provided by our commander. It will be of 0% surprise to me if this therefore causes high-budget Sythis players to also include combo pieces like Walking Ballista. Give the Ballista lifelink, ping an opponent, refund the +1 counter, repeat ad infinitum. Cards like a Johnny's Chosen may not make the cut anymore if combos like this get thrown in to help expedite the end of the game once the Sythis player constructs their Pillow Fort. Speaking of life gain, I think it would also be perfectly fair if Sythis players bypassed the Shalai and the Jol Rael editions I mentioned earlier in exchange for cards like Archangel of Thune. This is a very efficient way to quickly pump up the team with just our commander's life gain trigger. And if we're looking for mana sinks too, well, Finale of Devastation does a dang good job of pumping up a team for lethal, while also recovering or tutoring an important creature. So I could totally see that card winding up in more expensive Sythis decks too. Finally, don't be surprised if Starfield of Nyx gets cut from optimized decks, because it is one of the riskier endgame cards. In exchange, advanced protection effects might find their way into the deck. Greater Oromancy, for instance, is an expensive but impressive protection piece to potentially pursue. And of course, the biggest of budgets will naturally undo the swaps I made at the very start of this video, so Serra Sanctum and Replenish will find a very regal home in lavish Sythis decks. But enough with the honorable high-budget cards. Let's finally take a look at the deck for our Sythis Lord. A link to this version of the deck can be found in the description below with cuts in the maybe board. But remember, this is just the first list of 2. We still have some budget options to discuss in part 3. Look, if the Empire can rebuild the Death Star out of scrap metal, we can absolutely cut the price of this deck down. In fact, if we strike it down, it may even come back more powerful than we could imagine. Even with the expensive cards we cut earlier, there are still a lot of expensive cards in this list, and we just don't need to spend a bunch of money to make this deck flourish. I won't swap 100% of the pricey cards, but I'm going to take out the 10 most expensive ones. So let's do a great big lightning round of cuts to reduce the cost of this deck even more. First, some 1-mana cards. Exploration and Burgeoning are pricey. Great cards, but we're not obligated to run them, especially if we save $40 by avoiding them. Speaking of which, Utopia Sprawl's price tag is full-on insanity. Woof. No ma'am. Enlightened Tutor is also not light on the wallet. We don't need them. Both of these effects have budget versions in the deck already, so we'll be okay. Moving up in the mana costs, Sylvan Library is also pretty obnoxiously priced. Love you, Sylvie, but if you're gonna cost nearly $66, then it's going to be Order 66 for you. Argothian Enchantress is also the most expensive of the Enchantresses. Our commander draws like a bazillion cards already. We'll be okay without it. Heroic Intervention is next. Card's amazing. Card's also lots of dollars. Let us rid ourselves of any pull towards the light side and remove heroes from the picture. Lastly, we've come to the 3 and 4 mana cards. Dryad and Heliod are brilliant Theros cards, and Smothering Tithe is, Smothering Tithe. And cutting these saves another $60+. Yoink them out of the list. Now those were the 10 most expensive cards, but before we get to the actual budget inclusions though, I've got one more pit stop to make. The lands! Some of these lands are just unreasonably expensive because of their use in other formats. These do not need to be the droids we're looking for. We've got a swath of budget alternatives, so let's swap them straight across. My personal favorite is the way that Crows and Verge can interact with dual-type lands. So, okay, with that settled, what are we adding to the deck? Well, to fit in with our myriad of excellent enchantment-based removal effects, Lignify has to be my first callout. I really like this card to shut down an enemy creature and draw us cards along the way. I also think it's important to note that we got a decent number of expensive mana acceleration enchantments when we were making budget cuts. Let's get some other enchantment ramp in here to help replace all that. Market Festival and Dawn's Reflection are happy budget versions to help us get into a late game mana paradise. Omen of the Hunt is weird, but it is ramp, and it's almost always going to draw us a card, if not several, and it can even stick around to help pump up the effects of our sphere of safeties. And let's also round this out with a Font of Fertility, which is our enchantment version of a Wayfarer's Bauble, except this one has the added benefit of potentially drawing us cards. As ramp effects go for this deck, this is actually a pretty good draw in the late game, even if we're at the point that we don't need to use its ability. Something I'm keen to preserve is the protection for our permanents. Resurgent Belief helps us out, but protecting from mass destruction is important, I feel. Heroic Intervention was in this deck for a reason, you know? Bane of Progress absolutely wrecks us, as do a myriad of other destroy all enchantment cards. So I think a good budget replacement for that card is going to be Cosmic Intervention. If someone ever does land that enchantment destroying effect, this card can sneak them all right back into play for us and possibly even trigger a bunch of constellation effects along the way. On the subject of destruction, an easy way to punch up our power is to look for other potentially one-sided board wipes. We discussed some earlier, but I have another idea here too, one I debated putting into the main deck for a long time. Slaughter the Strong is better than it looks. It gets around indestructible, which is very, very clean. While it doesn't kill 100% of creatures, it still often leaves our opponents with only like one creature left in play, which our Pillow Fort and Transformational Auras are pretty happy to handle. The important part though is that this board wipe just basically doesn't affect our enchantresses, because they have like no power at all. A board wipe that whittles down the biggest, baddest stuff without affecting our draw engines? That's pretty spicy. You know, I'm feeling really inspired about these methods of protection, and equally as inspired about those cards like the Flickering Ward and the Whip Silk that we added. So, you know what? Here's another cool bounce enchantment that we should check out too. Y'all heard of Gossamer Chains? This thing's annoying as heck. It can't bounce back at will, but it is an amazing Pillow Fort piece that can also give us a ton of Enchantress triggers. Go ahead and attack. It'll probably cost you a bunch of mana to do it, and it'll also force you to pay the price of letting us get even more Enchantress triggers next turn. Finally, let's talk win conditions. The same rules apply like last time, where we have some decent mana sinks, but it's not like we're upgrading to Archangels of Thune and Heliod combos. I think it's possibly even more important for us to have additional win condition options in the more budget version of this deck. The expensive cards that were in the deck assisted us by streamlining things, which allowed us to rely upon a few specific win conditions because we were more likely to set up the circumstances that would make those cards lethal. In this version, we have slightly less of that streamlined quality, which means it strategically behooves us to keep our options varied and unpredictable. Therefore, I've got two creatures to look at here, Nylea's Colossus and Celestial Ancient. The Ancient actually almost made the cut in the first version of the list. If you want to use this one instead of the Shalai I suggested earlier, I wouldn't blame you. This is a hella cool way to permanently pump up our tokens for a strong late game, particularly with those self-bounce enchantments. And when we're flickering some enchantments 3 or 4 times in a single turn, never underestimate the power of the Colossus to turn even a 2/2 creature into the biggest and deadliest thing on the board. Those are our official swaps, but to be perfectly honest, there are tons of other changes you could keep making to keep lowering the budget. Aura Shards, for example, is over $10, so maybe consider an Open the Vaults to reclaim lost enchantments instead. Song of the Dryads isn't cheap, but you know what? Maybe you don't mind infinite combos, so you could look into Gauntlets of Light. This pairs with the Sanctum Weaver in the deck to create infinite mana by repeatedly untapping itself with the bunches of mana that it produces. There are way more cuts you could make to this deck if you want to keep the price low, and you don't even have to sacrifice its power. Sythis has tons more potential, and lots of faraway galaxies to explore. But I probably gotta stop, so for now, I think this here should do it. Here we have a more budget version of the deck, with a far more modest price tag than where we began. You can find both versions of the deck in the description below, with the cuts in the maybe board. Sythis looks forward to completing your training, and if there are other cards you believe should be recruited to join the dark side, make sure that you leave your suggestions for them below. Do it! Okay. Thanks so much for watching, everyone.